Thank you, Martha. Well, many of us in this room are familiar with some of our ELL's economic struggles to survive. Now, in this time and age where corporate profits in this country are at an all-time high, and companies like General Electric paid no taxes on their profits, several weeks ago, the Los Angeles Unified School District voted to dismantle the adult education program and gave pink slips to every administrator, staff, and teacher in the adult education program, despite having $700 million in reserve. So it's not only our students who are at risk, but it's also we as teachers who are under attack. And because of that, I'm here to talk about class. And as Walter Ben Michaels argues, schools have become our primary mechanism for convincing ourselves that poor people deserve their poverty. And Teresa Ebert and Masoud Zabarzadeh have said the social differences that separate people from each other, most Americans believe, have nothing to do with class. They are part of people's own individuality. Poverty is not seen as part of the working of the market, but as caused by the culture of poverty. Individuality is a convenient cover-up for social inequalities. So we live in a society where most forms of discrimination, whether it's based on race, gender, sexual orientation, and so forth, are now declared illegal, except for the economic forms of discrimination. If you recall an old Simpsons episode where there was a sign outside what the Simpsons called the rich people's mall, our prices discriminate because we can't. So I'm going to be talking about three interconnected issues today. One is about what class actually means. And then I'll be showing two quick examples from an EAP curriculum textbook that shows the representation of a particular type of class and its consumption. And then, of course, the third part is what we as teachers can do to address this. My own personal experience involving my ELL students was way back in 1992, a year after my first teaching position at a private ESL school in the Koreatown district of Los Angeles. And within a year after the Rodney King beating by the Los Angeles Police Department, when the verdict was reached and acquitted those 4 police officers, there was an uprising across Los Angeles. Now, the media had framed this as one of race. Well, because Rodney King was an African-American man, i.e., therefore, African-Americans were protesting. But what they failed to acknowledge was that in several of the black communities across Los Angeles, the middle-class ones and the more affluent ones, such as Ladera Heights, the so-called Black Beverly Hills, there was not one instance of any rioting. So there was clearly a poor people's uprising that involved not only the black communities, Latino communities, and of course the Korean communities, because it was part of that surrounding area. So many of my students, the Latino and Korean students, were directly impacted by these riots. So I saw firsthand the effects of the very poor attacking the semi-poor, where the rich escape the physical wrath. And so this brings up the question, though, the categorization of some of our ELLs, which we are here to talk about, of course, the poverty and exclusion of some, but compared with what Stephanie Van Drick, who's going to be presenting on this panel, has called the new global elite. So how do we square those two constituencies where we have the more affluent international new global elite students who are coming and the immigrant students who are struggling to survive? And in our own classrooms, which audience, we might ask, are these ELT curriculum materials actually addressing? And Shori Ortnet talks about class and says, it exists in America, but it cannot be talked about, that it is hidden, that there is no language for it, but that it's displaced or spoken through other languages of social difference, race, ethnicity, and gender. Ebert and Zabarzadeh has said, people fear class because class makes people confront the actuality that social disparities are not individualistic, that is, exceptional or accidental. They are instead built into capitalism itself. Social differences are systemic, not eccentric. But class as a discourse has appeared within the past year, and it's about time. So with the start of the Wisconsin movement and the Occupy movement, of which I've been a part in Los Angeles, the class discourse has talked about the 1% versus the 99%. And I'm going to be talking about what actually is that 99%. And the U.S. Census data reports that nearly half of all Americans are at poverty or near poverty levels. We know that. And again, as I mentioned in the beginning of the talk, that corporate profits, despite being at all-time high, the current talk amongst this administration has talked about even lowering the tax rate to 28%, compared with that in the Eisenhower administration, who, of course, we remember, I being a Republican, it was over 52%. So is there any doubt that class warfare is alive and well in this country? And a quick illustration of this will just show you. During the 1920s, leading up to the Depression, as you can see in the pie chart coded red, the top 1%, that was their share of income growth. In the 1960s, when the post-war settlement, the majority of us had that income growth, and it's now returned to those pre-Depression levels. So, which class are we talking about? When we mention class, what do I actually mean by class? The meaning of class is slippery and often not strictly defined. I'm going to attempt to define it in the ways in which I'm going to use it today. So a couple of questions you might ask yourselves and our students is, which is class a group or a culture to which you belong? Is it merely your income level, your economic category, the so-called middle class with which most teachers identify themselves? Is it your social position in the labor market, your occupation? For example, are you a lawyer? If you're a lawyer, well, you're doing okay. Property ownership in this country is usually defined as owning a house, the so-called Great American Dream. Or, to bring up that old moral reprobate, German philosopher Karl Marx, is class your relationship to how you produce and how either you or someone else appropriates and extracts what you produce and distributes your labor basically without your democratic consent. So there's a tension between the notions of class, of social hierarchy, and the economic relations of labor and production, that last definition. And Raymond Williams, in his seminal work, Keywords, helps us to delineate that. So he says, on one hand, the middle class implied hierarchy, and therefore implied lower class, not only theoretically, but in repeated practice. On the one hand, working implied productive or useful activity, which would leave all who were not working class unproductive and useless, easy enough for an aristocracy, but hardly accepted by a productive middle class. And it's to this day the confusion reverberates. And he says the middle class with which the earners of salaries normally line themselves is an expression of relative social position and thus of social distinction. The working class, specialized from the different notion of the useful or productive classes, is an expression of economic relationships. Thus, the two common modern class terms rest on different models, and the position of those who are conscious of the relative social position, middle class, and thus of social distinction, and yet within the economic relationship, sell and are dependent on their labor, is the point of critical overlap between the models and the terms. So, which are we? Middle class or working class? I will address that in a few minutes, but in terms of resonating representations on ELT textbooks, as John Gray pointed out, they do feature images of privileged aspirational lifestyles. Privileged, usually white middle class displays of consumption. At the same time, they do celebrate cultural diversity, increasingly so in recent years, but do they ignore economic inequalities? What are the social realities of this content, we might ask? And do these representations resonate with our ELLs who are at risk, with their experiences, aspirations, or are they at odds with their everyday lives? So we're going to take a quick look at two passages from an English for Academic Purposes textbook titled exactly that. And the chapter, Characteristics Affecting Consumer Behavior, starts with the framing questions. Why do people buy DVDs? What desire are they fulfilling? Is there a psychological or sociological explanation for why consumers purchase one product and not another? So here's the opening passage. I'll read this. You can read along with me, of course. Consumer purchases are influenced strongly by cultural, social, personal, and psychological characteristics. We apply them to the case of a hypothetical consumer. Jennifer Wong, a 26-year-old brand manager working for a multinational packaged goods company in Toronto. Jennifer was born in Vancouver, but her grandparents came from Hong Kong. She's been in a relationship for 2 years, but isn't married. She has decided she wants to buy a vehicle, but isn't sure she wants to buy a car. She rode a motor scooter while attending university and is now considering buying a motorcycle, maybe even a Harley.
Whoa.
Now, one of the interesting things in this textbook is there is no footnote to explain Harley. And so the assumption is that all the students will automatically know this global branded commodity, or Harley Davidson. For those of you who may not be motorcycle aficionados, Harleys run from anywhere from $7,500, that's the cheap model, to upwards of $35,000, more than most cars. The second paragraph goes on in the textbook. Let's consider a hypothetical consumer. How will Jennifer Wong's cultural background influence her decision about whether to buy a motorcycle? Jennifer's parents certainly won't approve of her choice. Tied strongly to the values of thrift and conservatism, they believe she should continue taking the subway instead of purchasing a vehicle. However, Jennifer identifies with her Canadian friends and colleagues as much as she does with her family. She views herself as a modern woman in a society that accepts women in a wide range of roles, both conventional and unconventional. She has female friends who play hockey and rugby. Women riding motorcycles are becoming a more common sight in Toronto. All right, well, we could talk on and on about this, but there's a couple of quick points I'd like to make. One is, on these two passages, obviously there is a focus on consumption, in the ways in which Jennifer is able to own particular objects of desire, in this case, a Harley. And in most EAP textbooks, there is that focus of owning stuff on objects rather than owning other people's labor. This idea also of consumption producing particular identities. Now, of course, there's been a huge amount of work on identity in the last 10 to 15 years in our field. But in terms of how consumption produces identities, this idea of this so-called cultural equality, not only of this particular woman of color, hypothetical woman of color, is able to buy and ride a motorcycle, but it's shown in this display of agency, which has also been talked about recently, and it's this resistance. So in the fact that she's showing her resistance to her so-called parents' cultural conservatism and thrift. And there's also this notion that consuming practices are an equal opportunity. The classic narrative, you work hard, you're able to afford these things. And lastly, we might ask with our students this notion of a freedom of choice, or this idea that she's able to choose, or should we talk about freedom from necessity? And so returning to my earlier topic on class and TESOL instructors, I'd like for us to think about not just the students who are at risk, but we as teachers who are at risk. Because, as Curtis points out, schools and universities are, on one hand, complex social sites comprised in parts of knowledge, practices, disciplines, and forms of power, a la Foucault, but also the production, extraction, and distribution of surplus labor, our labor. So, one question we might ask ourselves as teachers are, what is our relationship to labor? How, in which ways do we produce and sell this labor, our teaching labor? Or we might ask ourselves, are we the ones who purchase and appropriate this surplus labor? The argument is that there is no third class. There is no middle class. That is a fiction. The middle class is a fraction of the working class. So for those of us who produce and sell our labor, we are all working class. That is part of the narrative of the 99%. And why am I talking about this? Because this is a way for us as teachers to acknowledge, on one hand, the commodity of ESL that we produce, but also the new understandings, emotional responses, and change power relations with our students, which help to create the terms in and through which subjects come to recognize themselves, grasp their circumstances, and to imagine their futures. And so, in conclusion, critical literacy approaches to these types of texts can help these students engage with these materials that portray and reflect these images and representations that they may find incongruent with their own everyday lived experiences. And in doing so, this can lead to new ways in which students can imagine and generate alternatives to organizing our society so that we all can fully participate democratically to change the existing system. And so going forward on the next steps, in acknowledging that we are part of the working class would lead to a broader alliance than ones built on just strictly race or gender or other identifications. And this alliance is based on the recognition and understandings of class that go beyond that fictional working class, middle class divide, which could lead to solidarity built on broad-based community in which people share membership in having their surplus labor appropriated and distributed without their democratic consent, with the aim of completing the democratic project, which means simply going beyond voting every 2 or 4 years, but we are voting at the workplace. And so what, as Paulo Freire says, education either functions as an instrument in which to facilitate integration of the younger generation into the logic of the present system, which many of them already reject or resist, or it becomes a practice of freedom, the means by which men and women deal critically and creatively with reality and discover how to participate in the transformation of their world. And so specifically, how we as teachers can get involved both locally and globally. One such movement, Teachers for Social Justice, which started in San Francisco, which is a chapter. There's a chapter just opened up in Chicago and I believe in Boston. I encourage all of you to go to their websites. They're doing great work. They're working with the community, with parents, with students. These are the concrete steps in which teachers can take. For those of you from other cities, I encourage you to get involved in these local chapters as well. Thank you.
What we'd like to do is take a few questions now, especially because we recognize that people have other sessions here. They might not be ready to stay for our whole panel, and then have a longer conversation after all the speakers. So,
Okay.
Yes, sir. First of all, thank you for your presentation. What you said was very powerful. However, I work with kids who have had interrupted education or no education in an Austin public school. That's who I am. And your PowerPoint was nice to follow, and it was it seemed a little ivory tower for yours truly. Is there a, lack of a better term, student-friendly version of what the issues were that you're talking about? Because it seems as though you want us to take the message and appropriate that message to our students, which is a wonderful idea, I agree, but I can't wax poetic like you to my ESL kids.
Right, no, point well taken. And there are a lot of resources. For example, you're probably familiar with the website Rethinking Schools. They offer a plethora of curriculum materials in which it breaks these issues down that makes it accessible for K through 12. So Rethinking Schools website and their journal. They also have a page on Facebook, of course. Teachers for Social Justice. The Howard Zinn project, I believe, also has a lot of resources in which they present, unspoken about chapters in American history and world history that contextualizes present-day struggles. So those websites would provide many of the themes, but accessible in the classroom, K through 12, that you're seeking. Yeah, sure. Yes.
Chris, I loved your presentation.
Oh, thank you, sir.
It's very, very interesting. And I love the way you put it all together because I think we have to really think about the masses of people. You know, like you were talking about, you reacted to Rosa's thing. I was thinking very similarly that, you know, an individual's experience is one thing. But when we look at a classroom, I mean, I look at, you know, I'm from Oakland and I'm right in the middle of the city. I teach in a community college. And I have to assume that most of my students are dealing with trauma, poverty, stress, immigration problems, whatever. I assume that. So, I mean, how you relate to, you know, individually, it's hard with that many people. And what you're talking about is, we're talking about, you know, 90%. I mean, if you talk about 90%, that's a huge number of people. We have unemployment right now at skyrocketing levels. And I'm educating, we're working with people who are trying to do career changes. What hope do they have for any career change, you know? Anyway, it just brought up a lot of very interesting thoughts for me, and thank you very much. I also wanted to find out that Ebert and Zarga, what is that?
I can tell you, it's from their book, Class and Culture.
Class and Culture. That sounds very interesting, some of their things. And I wanted to recommend to everyone this incredible film, A Better Life. It's about a Mexican immigrant. But what it shows there is very similar to what Rosa talked about, is that low profile, you know, wanting to keep yourself hidden, keep yourself down. What does that do to a person? You know, it's amazing. Anyway, it's a good film.
Oh, I think there's one more. Oh, sorry.
Thank you. That was really inspiring. I just wanted to actually share a story. Here in Philadelphia, we're going through a school closing process. We have a lot of charterization going on. The school district is in terrible financial straits. And last night was the vote about whether or not to close 9 public schools, which all serve chronically poor students in chronically poor neighborhoods. And 2 schools managed to stave off closing because they organized and they banded together. And from day one, they came out as a force. These are 2 really small schools, 250 kids or less, into incredibly poor neighborhoods. And it was really, really inspiring the way in which the people in the communities, the schools, the families, and business leaders in those communities were able to change the minds of the commissioners. And last night, instead of taking those, as they voted on the school closures, the commissioners actually came out right in front of the issue and said, we're not even going to vote on these schools. You've shown us that you're successful and that you care, and we're going to continue on. And so, to me, that's a real message about how much leadership we can take as individuals when we gather together with others who really believe in the same things. And I think it really is, this is the moment, and change can happen, but you have to do it with others.
Thank you. I